Hello, thank you so much for having me. I'm Jonathan Ong. I'm a communications professor at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. It's a rare and welcome opportunity for me to be in dialogue with a community with such a profound impact in public life. Religious belief, practice, and community shape many people's very notion of truth and fallibility, as well as the compassionate imperative to listen to and care for others who we may even consider to be our enemies. And these tensions rearticulate themselves in new and profound ways in the context of digital disinformation and fake news. It's important to be discussing these and how the notion and the environment of social media transforms these debates and tensions. You should also know that I was educated in a Jesuit school for 16 years, and so I'm steeped in the tradition of spiritual reflection that is based on context and experience. And so I find this conversation especially meaningful. My work is engaged with interviewing communities, doing participant observation in local cultures, and understanding people where they come from, how they justify themselves, how they rationalize certain actions and beliefs. And so the notion of ethics in everyday life is very much consistent in my own work. And so I think there's a lot of generative conversation to be had here. So my expertise is in the ethics and politics of media, particularly social media. And I have specific area expertise in the Philippines, Hong Kong, China, and Singapore. And the field of communication studies, you should know, is being called recently to really explain how social media have transformed the conduct of politics. And I think what I hope is useful to your meeting today will be a general overview of some of the key debates and concepts in our field that might be relevant to to your discussion. So I'll be outlining some of those central questions that animate our discussion today. And then I'll be presenting from my own ethnographic bottom up research that examined the industry of political trolling in the Philippines and our specific interventions, regulatory interventions, and suggestions around that. And then I will end with some reflections on ethics and morality and how we might be able to move forward toward some collaborative interventions. So you can reach me on Twitter at Jonathan underscore C underscore Ong. You can also email me at jcong@umass.edu if you have any questions about my presentation entitled The Architecture of Disinformation, Rethinking Faith-Based Interventions in Asian Contexts. So these are some of the burning questions that have really fired up and framed a lot of the issues and debates in the field of communication studies, but beyond that. So the first question is whether social media actually won the elections for Trump, but you could also substitute any kind of populist authoritarian figure or also a controversial vote such as Brexit. Of course, in Asia, one could look at Duterte's election, which happened before Trump and before Brexit. One can also look at Modi in India, the rise of the far right in Europe, and the question of how exactly online communities or new specific technologies have been weaponized to mobilize particular kinds of anger and resentment from the people. How were social media central or perhaps peripheral to some of these kind of electoral victories? And I think it's important to have this question at the back of our minds, but we should also be thinking about how social media is important beyond just elections. Beyond the spectacular moment of elections, social media have profound new ways of organizing conversation, of orienting our attention towards some issues rather than others. And so we need to broaden out our perspective beyond just this focus on elections and whether it influences our votes. A second key question that, of course, is results in very different answers and very polarized opinions, even among communication professors, is when did fake news actually begin? So one might think about some of the imposter websites that came up around the time of Trump, around the time of Brexit and Duterte. If you recall, there were some imposter websites trying to masquerade as CNN or Time magazine, but were obviously misspelled. So it would be spelled as T1me.com. So kind of like an impostertime.com website. And those were new forms of fake news in social media that we haven't seen before, um, and that have caught up and generated a lot of scholarly conversation and public conversation. At the same time, some scholars do want to step back from this and understand the historical roots and lineages of fake news. So, what is the relationship between fake news today and, for example, political public relations and spin doctoring? These forms have been there for a while. At the same time, the idea of rumors, particularly in conflict situations, that has always been there. And rumors, as a way of explaining the inexplicable, have been talked about in anthropology for a long time. And so, scholars and this debate of when did fake news actually begin? Should we be alarmed? Should we be panicking about social media's fake news? Or should we see it as rooted in older historical practices? That is a debate that is ongoing in the field and in public conversation, and we should be thinking about those tensions and the ideological motives of historicizing when fake news actually began. Another key burning question that informs my research in particular, but the research of others, but also has changed even academic publishing today, is this whole notion of should we understand the rationality of the Trump supporter? And of course, you can substitute Trump supporter with the Modi supporter, the Duterte supporter, any kind of populist public who is angry and resentful at the mainstream liberal elites or the establishment, if you will. So there's an imperative, of course, from some scholars, particularly anthropologists, sociologists, ethnographers such as me, to venture out to understand how exactly certain emotions led to a particular worldview for these types of people, and explaining away the sequence of events that led people towards having a particular ideology or political affinity, right? At the same time, some scholars are quite critical of some of these approaches. Some of the think pieces that one might read in the New York Times or the Washington Post that provide a profile of the white working class voter in Louisiana, for example. So in the field, there's a debate that goes, are we not just contributing to normalizing these radical opinions of obviously racist people? Maybe we should not give them this highly visible and highly public platform. And I think this is an important debate, and quite a new debate that we're having, of like, why are we even publishing this kind of research, and what are the ideological motives of some research. And that's a question that I think people should be having directly. And it's also a discussion of research ethics that could that includes some insights from faith-based communities such as yourselves. So those are three originating burning questions. And now I'll be giving you some of the social media specific discussions that might be helpful for you to understand how social media might be transforming political discussion and political conversation today. So, in the field, there are some scholars who kind of emphasize very powerful new effects that social media are having on political conversation, and attribute quite a great deal of power on new technologies and its impact on society. So there's scholars, and these are scholars from Oxford in particular, that have studied Twitter bots. So these are um, automated scripts that allow you to create fake accounts and retweet and amplify particular kinds of messages. At one click of a button, it would amplify and circulate the same kind of content across multiple thousands of accounts, for example, and how it might be changing and shifting the conversation. There's also survey-based studies, such as in the second point here, that look at how click armies or paid trolls have been hired for political campaigns around the world. And these kinds of studies often focus on what is new and what is novel, and talk about the novelty of social media and its profound impacts on society at large. Some of them I'm quite critical of for overly focusing on one technology at the expense of others. My approach has been trying to look at technologies in relation to each other. So fake news and disinformation, I would say, are really deployed across multiple platforms, such that one message is intended to influence messages across other kinds of websites. But these are some important studies to kind of highlight what is new about social media. What are very convincing new arguments about technological change in politics? And here's one that I find extremely convincing, from Zeynep Tufekci. So her writing was specifically about YouTube, but it could apply to other social media. But YouTube as a platform specifically might be seen as a radicalizing instrument. That's her argument. So, whereas in the past, dissidents who might be holding very extreme opinions or ideologies might be separated out and feel isolated, now social media provide them an opportunity to find like minded people and know that they're not alone in holding this worldview. And so there's ways in which algorithmic recommendations on YouTube might lead you, quote unquote, down the rabbit hole. And there's one, a quotation from her article in the MIT Technological Review, where Tufekci says, on YouTube, you can never be more extreme. So as you watch one YouTube clip, it would recommend you towards a more radical video that will express a more radical opinion from what you started with. And she argues that it's not because YouTube intends to plot to drive the world off a cliff. But a more likely explanation, she says, has to do with the nexus of artificial intelligence and Google's business model. YouTube, of course, is owned by Google. And for all its lofty rhetoric, Google is an advertising broker selling our attention to companies that will pay for it. And therefore, these kind of recommendation mechanisms intend for YouTube users to stay on the platform longer. And so it forces people down into a rabbit hole. And I think that's one tendency in which we should be wary about what social media is doing nowadays to political ideologies. A second convincing argument that she really advances, and I'm very convinced by, is how social media acts as a social echo chamber. where social media might be seen, understood through the metaphor of a football stadium, where online we're connected with our communities and we seek approval from our like minded peers. We bond with our team by yelling at the fans of the other one. So, our cognitive universe isn't exactly an echo chamber. So she disagrees with the perspective that we're actually only exposed to opinions that are exactly like ours. She rejects that and says that evidence would suggest through social media, through the internet, we now have access to multiple points of views. But what is an echo chamber is our social dynamics and social connections. And so Tufekci actually warns against the various projects for fact checking. So, fact checking interventions kind of want to expose what is the wrong argument or the wrong evidence held by other people. But for Tufekci, that's not really what social media is about. Social media is about belonging, and belonging, to quote her, is stronger than facts. And I'm quite sympathetic to this kind of skepticism to fact checking. Fact checking wants to advance a very rationalist approach to targeting disinformation, to exposing lies and falsehoods or wrong evidence. And while fact checking interventions are really important, really meaningful, well intentioned, um, it might not fit the social media architecture, which is really about community, which is about belonging, which is really this kind of football stadium approach of finding the communities that share your worldview, however extreme or however even wrong it might be. So, a less media centric argument or a less media centric approach to understanding politics nowadays would be um, studies, and these are studies from Arlie Hochschild and Hilary Pilkington, who spend a lot of time with people who we might consider quote unquote deplorable. So Arlie Hochschild spent um, her time immersing with Trump supporters in white working class Louisiana, in rural Louisiana. Hillary Pilkington spent her time with the English Defence League in the UK, and the English Defence League is a white nationalist activist group um, who actually perform very racist chanting and nationalistic flag waving. So these are similar kinds of approach that spend a lot of time interviewing, getting to know the worldview of these people, and reconstructing the sequence of events and moral justifications behind certain actions. So for Hawkshield, she uncovered what she calls the deep stories of Trump supporters who feel that, and she uses this metaphor that these people feel like they're waiting in line to be heard, to be listened to, and at some point, minorities or even women, ethnic minorities, but also women, have jumped ahead of them in line and such that they now feel they're strangers in their own land, such that they're like second class citizens where they really belong to. And similar argument by Pilkington, who try to understand English Defense League members, racist chanting, and nationalistic flag waving as, in their minds, actually forms of protest, forms of expressing voice, um, of standing loud and proud, the only way of being heard in a system that they perceive has ignored them, a structure that has oppressed them. And these are important studies, in my view. They're ways of empathizing, trying to understand where these people are coming from, and also the structure that has failed them and what is vulnerable about that very structure. Um, my argument, one gap of these kinds of studies is that they actually don't talk about the media or social media in particular, about how Trump supporters, for example, or English Defense League members might be actually organized, mobilized, manipulated by bad actors in social media. And that's where, as a communications professor, we also want to push some of these studies forward and say, yes, it's important to understand where emotions of anger and resentment are coming from, but we also need to understand how manipulation and disinformation is also crucial in organizing these groups towards particular ends. So I'll move now to just a few snapshots of historical arguments that are also present in the field. So the idea that fake news is actually an extension of older practices in journalism and political PR rather than a radical disruption. So there's some scholars in communication studies who argue that fake news is not actually new. We should not kind of like panic or attribute all blame to platforms such as Facebook or Twitter. They're not all to blame for where we are currently. In fact, fake news is an outcome of older illnesses in journalism, in public relations, in the political system at large. Um, Other kinds of historical arguments that I think are really important is how social media disinformation might ultimately really aim to manipulate the mainstream media agenda. And the concept here is attention hacking, a concept advanced by Alice Marwick and Rebecca Lewis, that they try to identify how mainstream media are in fact vulnerable to attention hacking on social media, how bad actors in social media engineer viral content in these platforms in order for these content to travel and influence the mainstream media headlines and the political agenda there. So, um, this argument kind of resituates fake news and disinformation within a broader ecosystem. The argument that I specifically advance in my own research is the idea of who these disinformation producers might be. Where do they come from? And my argument, and I'll be getting to that in greater detail, is that they're actually often not exceptional villains. Many of them are actually precarious digital workers, are ordinary people who at some point become complicit with bad actors and with bad practices in order to find ways to benefit themselves, to advance their own aims, personal aims, political aims, and also for aims for social mobility and class mobility. And it's important to understand disinformation workers and producers not as these kind of larger than life villain figures, but understanding them as ordinary people with very fallible and vulnerable, who are fallible and vulnerable to be complicit towards bad systems and bad structures. So now I'll be talking about my study, which is entitled "Architects of Network Disinformation." This is co-authored by with Jason Vincent Cabañas from the University of Leeds. And this study, which was published in February this year, and you can download it for free on newtontechfordev.com. It's an 82-page report that goes behind the scenes of how troll accounts are manipulated, how fake news is actually produced in the Philippines. And we were motivated by the questions of who are these producers of disinformation? Who are these authors of fake news? What are their work structures? Where do they come from? From what industries? How do they justify this work to others and themselves? How do these people sleep at night? So, what are their moral justifications? And ultimately, what are the political outcomes that they achieve? So, this was a way for us to kind of like step back from this dynamic of being shocked at disinformation and fake news, and but trying to understand where the roots actually lie. And these are some of our key insights and key findings, which I think apply to disinformation production beyond the Philippines, but to disinformation production globally. So we developed the concept network disinformation. And what this refers to really is how the labor of political deception um, becomes distributed to a hierarchy of digital workers. And these digital workers and these work structures and work strategies in the Philippines in particular are rooted very much in the industries of advertising and public relations. So the leaders, the chief architects of disinformation come from advertising and public relations. These are the people who are responsible for the branding of politicians, to improve their branding, to improve their image, but and also to tarnish other rivals' branding and image. So these digital workers, the work of creating fake news websites and troll accounts, are actually project-based and sideline jobs. So no one was a full-time troll. Everyone takes on a troll project on the side as an add-on to existing quote unquote respectable work. So these people have day jobs as corporate marketers, as people who run websites, as graphic designers, sometimes even as administrative staff of politicians. So they only take this as add on work. And because it's only a project based arrangement that is finite and short term, and it's only a sideline job, the very work architecture of a disinformation campaign enables these people this process of moral displacement. They're able to deny responsibility. So they're able to say, I'm not really a full time troll. Somebody else is the worst kind of culprit here. Somebody else is a worse kind of troll. So nobody would kind of admit to the real consequences of what they do, just because the kind of work that they do is very much limited to delivering on a specific kind of strategy or specific kind of deliverable for this kind of project. So I'll be taking you through how this work structure is actually distributed. And here is an infographic that is part of our report, which again you can download on newtontechfordev.com. So as you can see, it's a hierarchy of different kinds of disinformation workers. And then, of course, with the idea that some people are paid, and then some content depends on voluntary labor of the public. So the political clients are at the top of the food chain, of course, and they have a certain agenda. They want to be elected for president, or not just for president, but even for lower level local positions. They would hire campaign strategists, digital strategists. And these digital strategists are the architects of disinformation, and these are often advertising and PR executives who end up recruiting and leading disinformation teams. So they assemble this entire team of fake account operators. So advertising and PR executives directly liaise with their political clients. They harness their knowledge in corporate marketing and transpose that to political marketing. And a lot of the strategies that they use for a political campaign were tried and tested first for a shampoo brand or a soft drinks brand in corporate marketing. So they see digital political operations as a new challenge and also a new venture. So they see themselves as becoming innovators in this new arena, in this new sphere, and therefore they justify some of the kind of work that they do as through the lens of experimentation. They want to be seen as innovators in this particular arena and sometimes have ways of fictionalizing and kind of like gamifying the work that they do. So they would sometimes even draw from popular culture references to explain away and justify the bad work that they're doing. So for example, we had one advertising strategist who said, "I see myself as Olena Tyrell of Game of Thrones. This is all just a game for me." And that's one way in our work, we interpret that as a kind of moral denial. They're pushing and blocking the real consequences by what they do by fictionalizing, drawing from popular culture to explain the actual work that they're doing. So the chief architects of disinformation set the strategy, but they need people to translate the strategy to the street. They need people who can speak the language of the masses, who are fluent in gutter language and the street language. And that's where the digital influencers come in. Digital influencers could be key opinion leaders like celebrities who have a lot of followers, or they could be anonymous digital influencers. These are very popular, funny accounts on Twitter, for example, who might be kind of like a parody account. Think of like a parody politician account or a popular culture meme account who would be having a specific kind of brand of comedy in their work, but at some point they will be slipping in political content and hashtags onto their feed. And what digital influencers are supposed to do is to speak the language of the masses, to convey political strategy, to really activate the anger and emotions of resentment from the masses. In our work, we use the term popular vernaculars. These influencers who are very famous in social media are very fluent in the pop culture references that the masses can really understand and are sympathetic to. So, how do they justify themselves? In our work, we say that they express discourses of normalization. They say that, the kind of work that I do, I also do this anyway for a shampoo brand. What's the difference between selling my Twitter content, my posts, to a shampoo brand versus a politician? It's all the same to me. So again, normalization is a discourse that blocks the moral responsibility in the work that they do. At the same time, digital influencers are from the middle class or even from the precarious middle class, and therefore they see this as taking as providing them financial security. And then at the lower level of digital influencers are community level fake account operators who do script based work to create what we call illusions of engagement. So these are workers whose main aim is to just retweet, repost, share, like, comment on the influencer's content to make sure it goes viral, to make sure that these content are still visible in the algorithms on Facebook and YouTube and Twitter. And their moral justifications are around career and financial security as well. So they see this kind of work as temporary. It's They want to be actually to be part of the creative industries and see this as a stepping stone towards more respectable kinds of jobs. So now it's crucial to talk about what happens when a disinformation campaign reaches the public. And in our work, we talk about this very porous boundary here between the paid kind of worker and the real voluntary kind of work. We call this the disinformation interface. It's actually a very porous boundary between a disinformation worker and a real supporter. Remember, this is just a project arrangement. So for some, they're actually paid for a project. At some point, they do it because they really believe in it. But at the same time, what we actually found was that disinformation campaigns intend to seed emotions of anger and resentment, so that the real political fan is emboldened to express this in even more vitriolic and unpredictable ways. So, in the context in the Philippines in particular, we found that our interviews with the influencers and fake account operators, they will tell us, we are not the ones who do the most misogynistic content. We kind of seed that idea, but we depend on the real fan to take it forward, which is a finding that is quite surprising and also quite disturbing, that the real vitriol, anger, death threats targeted at politicians, but even to some journalists, to women, they tend to be from real people rather than produced by disinformation workers. At the same time, though, these ideas were seeded by fake account operators, but they're taken forward in unpredictable ways, in ways that were not really conceptualized by the advertising and PR strategists, which enables the advertising and PR strategists to claim innocence, right? Like I was not the one who authorized misogynist hate speech towards a particular journalist, because it's actually the real supporter who did this. However, we need to be critical that this idea was seeded in particular memes and posts and content thought by the strategists. So now, what are the outcomes of disinformation? So my argument as an Asian scholar of social media and communication is that we shouldn't think about Asia as a site that would follow the trend of the West. That innovations of Trump, for example, become transplanted and copied, for example, by Duterte or Modi. We need to be thinking about how Asia is actually a site of authoritarian innovations in digital violence, because of its technological adoption. A lot of Asian countries lead in the acceleration of technological adoption and innovation. One could look at China and Korea and the Philippines as having some of the most active and largest social media users in the world. You've got Indonesia as one of the most vibrant and active on social media, and also in digital labor and outsourced digital labor. And at the same time, Asia has a lot of vulnerabilities around technological regulation and technological experimentation. So, a lot of the regulations of technology in Asia are not as developed and therefore as could be vulnerable. Um, to particular governments who want to advance their particular agenda. At the same time, the levels of conflict and the protracted nature of some of the conflict embedded in ethnic divides, religious divides have been there for a long time in India, such that one can see how lynch mobbing is organized via WhatsApp as a messaging platform. You can think about Myanmar, where Facebook is used by religious leaders who act as digital influencers who promote ethnic and religious violence. And because Myanmar is not an important, as important a market for Facebook, the content moderation of hate speech in Myanmar, and of course the problem of language here, how could we regulate, how could we monitor and capture hate speech in language other than English, becomes a huge problem in Myanmar. Cambodia is a country that was a test bed for Facebook experimentation of their algorithms, such that mainstream media sites on Facebook in Cambodia did not get amplification at some point because Facebook was testing the algorithm in Cambodia to see whether they could export it to other countries. The choice of why Cambodia rather than, of course, Canada or the US, of course, one could see political and economic motives behind that choice. Seeing Asia as this test bed for technological experimentation, for wanton technological experimentation without accountability, such that Asia becomes, therefore, a site for authoritarian innovations and digital violence to thrive. We need to be thinking about Asia and its specific attempts at interventions as raising a lot of questions and a lot of problems too. Malaysia tried to apply a fake news law, and that fake news law was very controversial because it was very evident that it ultimately aimed to silence dissidents, to silence people critical of government. And I think as a scholar, a scholar, I am very skeptical of content moderation of social media that becomes subsumed by the government itself and government control. It could lead towards the targeting of dissidents. The Philippines was named by Facebook and its global policy director as the patient zero in the fight against digital disinformation. And um, looking at the story of Duterte's rise and his campaign, which was social media dependent rather than mainstream media dependent. Um, and one can think about the many ways in which social media in the Philippines targeted people critical of Duterte, who normalized hate speech, which was, of course, already being circulated by Duterte himself in the context of a very violent drug war. It had new expression in social media and through digital violence and digital offense. Um, we discovered that a lot of Philippines disinformation were actually aiming for historical revisionism. And for the Filipinos in the audience, this is you will know that a lot of fake news websites and videos try to recast a violent um, uh, time in our history under the Marcos regime and the martial law regime, which had a lot of extrajudicial killings and human rights abuses. It was being recasted as a golden age of the country. And so that's one thing that we found a lot of evidence of in our project. So, one intervention by the Catholic Bishops' Council was to circulate a list of fake news websites. And blacklisting fake news websites is important for media literacy. And I think it's very well intentioned. I think it's a good small step, but I don't think it's enough because blacklisting fake news websites would not treat the underlying causes of the problem, and at the same time, we need to be very careful when we also circulate lists of fake news websites and fact checking initiatives that it should target disinformation across the political spectrum. If not, it might even entrench and deepen existing divides. And that's my one cautionary suggestion around interventions, which is about blacklisting or exposure or or fact checking. It doesn't treat the underlying causes of the problem. So let me end with these questions that I hope could be meaningful and generative for discussions of politics, but ultimately about ethics. How can faith based communities reinvigorate discussions of ethics in the everyday? And this was something that we found in our work talking with the people behind fake news. That actually complicity and collusion with bad actors is very easy. Choosing to do what is easy rather than what is right in a system that rewards and incentivizes um, these kinds of hateful, emotional, divisive kind of language, that's very problematic and that's very challenging to resist this when you have a whole system that kind of rewards people for being attention grabbing, for being shrill and shocking. How can faith based communities try to intervene in these kinds of issues of complicity and collusion? Um, and at the same time, how can religion try to think through that tension between, on one hand, trying to understand people who are other, who are um, emotional and resentful, but at the same time, produce critical analysis and critical judgment. How does one intervene there? What are the limits between this kind of what are the limits of like empathizing in this spirit of openness towards understanding bad actors? When do we also make that critical judgment? How can also doctrine guide us beyond discussions of truth and trustworthiness, which of course would tend to reduce things to black and whites, to absolutes, moral absolutes, to heroes and villains? How can we resituate discussions of truth and trustworthiness alongside other virtues of compassion, fidelity, loyalty, and prudence? And I think thinking about the tensions and interrelationships between these different kinds of virtues would lead us towards more collaborative and holistic kind of interventions. And that's what I want to explore with you guys through question time tomorrow. Thank you so much.